All right, so it's distinctly possible that this lesson had already begun with me in person, depending on what the timeline ends up being tomorrow. So if so, skip ahead to the right part. If not, today we're going to talk about the digestive system. And sorry, if you're hearing that in the background, that's my dog chewing on a bone. I'm sorry. Arlo, settle down. So let's get to it. So for today, lesson 3.6, the digestive system. Now we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail. But again, I want to keep in mind that sort of the concept of how we're looking at this, sort of our framework for all of this, is thinking about differentiated cells, right? So stem cells in your body undergo mitosis. After undergoing mitosis, you're left with specialized cells that perform specific tasks. And we have different types of tissues. You have muscle tissues, you have connective tissue, nervous tissue, and epithelial tissue, and these all interact. But we're also going to start thinking about how one system interacts with another. So you've already learned about our cardiovascular system, right? About how your heart and your blood works. And today, we're going to tie that into learning about our next system. So our digestive system is its own independent system, but you'll see that it works in tandem with the cardiovascular system, also known as the circulatory system. So, no further ado, the purpose of the digestive system is to absorb nutrients from food. I'm just going to check and make sure that I've got a reasonable... Yeah, okay. So we are absorbing nutrients from food. And with that in mind, we're going to kind of think about 4 stages that this has to happen in. You could think of 5, I guess, but the first is really we have to go out and get food. Putting that aside, the first stage is ingestion, which is as simple as saying we need to put food into our body for processing. And then once you've put food into your body, what do you have to do with it? So let's think about that for a minute. What do we do with the food that we put into our body? And I'm going to imagine that at this moment, Isaiah is yelling at me that we have to chew it. And that's true. We chew it and we swallow it and it goes into our stomach. And all of this is part of a process where we're taking big pieces of food, sometimes very big pieces of food, sometimes big solid pieces of food, and turning them into smaller pieces of food. And does anyone know what that process is called? Very good. Digestion. And digestion is where we break food into smaller particles and break large molecules in the food down into smaller ones. So that's kind of a 2-piece component. So half of that is just, chewing, right, and using our teeth and our tongue and our mouth and all these things to take a big piece of food and break it into pieces. But the second half of that is that we actually release chemicals that go and find the molecules that make up food and break them apart so that there's smaller molecules, smaller compounds, not really, really big ones. And that is going to make food easier to deal with chemically. So let's talk about that. After we have digested food, after we've taken the big pieces of food and broken them into small ones, and then taken the big molecules inside of food and broken them into smaller ones, then we're ready to actually take those smaller molecules, which will serve as nutrients for us, and absorb them. Small molecules from food which we call nutrients, are absorbed. And they're absorbed into the bloodstream. And why the bloodstream? Well, as Kyla is no doubt yelling at me, they're absorbed into the bloodstream because from there they can be moved throughout the body. Cool. And then, what is the last stage? Well, ingestion is where we put food into our body. Digestion is where we break it apart. Absorption is where we absorb all the small little molecules, the nutrients from the food we've digested. And then finally, everything that we don't absorb, we have to get rid of. And this is called egestion. But this is the removal of solid waste. So these are kind of the four main steps of digestion. Now, we're only going to cover digestion in a fairly simple way in this course. We'll cover digestion in more detail when we do grade 11 biology, and I hope all of you will take grade 11 biology. But for now, we're just going to kind of go in a little bit of detail. So we're going to talk about the anatomy of the digestive system, and that means the different body parts that are involved, and the physiology, which means what those parts do. Let's take a look. So we start with the mouth. And in the mouth, we use teeth to cut and to grind up, or I suppose I should say grind down, food. This is a process called mastication. But that's not all that happens. The tongue forces food against the hard palate at the top of the mouth, the roof of the mouth, to shape it. Basically into a ball. And this is known as a bolus, which is just the Greek word for ball. So teeth cut and grind food. The tongue forces food up against the hard palate and shapes it into a ball known as a bolus. And then finally, it's important to know that your saliva does what? Of course, we all know what saliva is. Saliva is the fluid that is released by the salivary glands, which are found inside the mouth. But the question is, what does saliva do? Well, saliva moistens the food, which makes it easier to shape. But it also contains chemicals known as enzymes, which begin to break down the molecules inside of food. And this is called chemical digestion. So chemically digest food. The most sort of primary enzyme contained inside of your saliva, you don't have to know this, but it's worth noting, is called amylase. And amylase is an enzyme that breaks down starches. So if you put, say, a cracker or or a piece of bread in your mouth, the amylase in your saliva will actually begin to break that starch down and cause it to come apart into smaller individual sugars. Now, that process doesn't happen fully in the mouth, but it begins in the mouth. And you could try this. We're not going to do this in class because it's frankly a little gross, though maybe we will. It's not a bad idea. Maybe we will. But anyway, you can try it at home yourself, which is if you put a cracker on a plate and drop some water on it, and then take another cracker and put it on another plate and drop an equal amount of saliva on it and see the difference, you'll see that the cracker that's been exposed to saliva decomposes to a much higher extent. And that's because saliva isn't just water. It's a lot of things. It's water-based, and there's mucus in there, but there's also the enzymes that break food down, not mechanically, not into smaller pieces, but actually chemically into smaller molecules. Notably, you have two structures that ensure that food goes where it's supposed to. The uvula is at the back of the mouth, and prevents food moving up into your nasal cavity. In fact, if anything tries to push past it, it triggers the gag reflex, which forces your body to push food out of its mouth. So under normal circumstances, your nose and mouth are connected. You know this because you can breathe in through your nose and you can breathe in through your mouth. And in both cases, the air makes its way down your throat. That's because they're connected. And if you've ever accidentally laughed while taking a sip of a drink, maybe you've had that drink come out of your nose. But normally, the uvula is at the back of your mouth to prevent food from moving into your nasal cavity. The epiglottis folds over the trachea. Does anyone know what the trachea is? Why, that's right, Alexander. It's your windpipe. So-called. It is the tube that leads down to your lungs to prevent food from going down there. We'll say to prevent food blocking the airway. That would be a better sentence. Food thus enters the tube that will take it down to the stomach, which is known as the... Anya, that's entirely correct. The esophagus. Or, if you're Dr. Brian James, my second-year anatomy professor, the esophagus. But I think it's esophagus. That's what everyone else I ever heard said anyway. So if you look here, if you take a look at this picture, this is a real picture, and it is what we call a mid-sagittal dissection. This is actually a living specimen. Well, sorry, not a living specimen. It was a specimen that was once living, that donated its body to science, and this individual was cut with a saw right down the middle. And so what you're seeing here is the inside of their head cut perfectly along that plane. And again, that's a real photograph. And if you look, this here is the tongue. I don't have to label that, but it's pretty crazy. Look how big your tongue is. You can actually palpate your tongue from outside the body. And if you feel under here, you're feeling the bottom side of your tongue. A very big organ. It has to do a lot of muscular work. There are the teeth. Here's the nasal cavity. And you can see that the nasal cavity and the mouth end up in the same place. That's the mouth, obviously, which right now is pretty much closed. But this area back here, which is common to both, we would call the throat. But above the throat, there's two noteworthy things. This is the uvula. And I didn't include a picture of it, but you know the uvula as, and I won't be too graphic here, but if somebody opens their mouth, the uvula dangles down from up above. A little kind of dangly ball here. Try not to be overwhelmed by my scientific language. A little dangly ball at the back of the throat. And again, that folds up and it prevents things from going to the nasal cavity. And if something tries to push past it, it triggers the gag reflex. And this down here is the epiglottis, which closes down over the windpipe to prevent anything from going down the windpipe. So this is the windpipe to the lungs. Known as the trachea. And this here is the esophagus, which is going to lead down to the stomach. Now remember we said that different types of tissues are important as we go. Well, as food goes down your throat and the uvula folds up, make sure it doesn't end up in your nose. The epiglottis folds down, make sure that it doesn't end up in your windpipe, your trachea. Food's going to go down the esophagus. Now there's something else you can try, which is if you're laying down and you eat a cookie, you can swallow it. Despite the fact that gravity isn't pulling the food into your stomach, the food will make its way to your stomach. In fact, you can do a handstand and eat a cookie, and it will end up in your stomach, despite the fact that you are upside down, because gravity isn't what pulls food down your esophagus. Food moves down your esophagus, and indeed through your whole digestive system, by a process called peristalsis. So food moves through the esophagus by peristalsis. And this is, for lack of a better explanation, and I'll put that back up in a moment, don't worry. For lack of a better explanation, this is like a tube of toothpaste. What happens is the food is in the tube, and there are sensors in the esophagus that detect the presence of food, and they trigger the muscle behind the food. The esophagus is a muscular tube, and they trigger the muscle behind the food to squeeze. And when they do that, they push the food down a bit more. And then it squeezes lower, pushing the food more, and lower, pushing the food more, and it just keeps doing that. It keeps squeezing lower and lower until the food makes its way out. Exactly how you would squeeze a tube of toothpaste to make the toothpaste come out the other end. The esophagus is made of muscle walls which squeeze behind the food to force it down the esophagus. feel free to pause this if you need to get that down. I'll even make it fit a little better. Food will leave the esophagus and enters the stomach. The stomach has 3 layers of muscle that squeeze and churn the food in it. And this furthers digestion. We call this mechanical digestion, in fact, because it is physically, mechanically breaking the food down. In fact, if you look at the stomach, it has 3 layers of muscle. It has 1 layer of muscles that go this way, and when they squeeze it as if to flatten it out, as if to make it like into a longer tube. It's got a 2nd layer of muscles that run this way, that squeeze to shorten it, as if you're pushing on these ends like that. And it's got a 3rd layer of muscles that go across like this, that kind of do a mixture of the both. They push in at that angle like that. And the result of which is that they churn and break that food down. And it's a lot like working with a dough, if you've ever made bread or anything like that. But the epithelial cells of the stomach also release acid and enzymes to chemically digest the food. They also produce a mucus lining to prevent the stomach digesting itself. So if you just released a bunch of hydrochloric acid and enzymes into the stomach and allowed it to interact with the cells of the stomach could very much damage itself. And so it releases a mucus lining that is all around the inner surface of the stomach, protecting those epithelial tissues from being damaged. If you know anyone in your life who's ever had a stomach ulcer, that's what we call the condition where that mucus lining has a gap in it. And that can be a very, very, very painful experience because the stomach is essentially digesting itself. It's being damaged by its own digestive juices. We could talk more about the stomach, but I do want to mention one thing that doesn't happen here, which may be surprising to us. Nutrients aren't absorbed in the stomach. We sometimes talk about that, or we sort of colloquially speak that way. We sort of say, oh, food's in my belly, and that's where I'm, enjoying all that. But really, your stomach is just there to break food down. It is beyond the stomach that we get to the intestines, and the intestines are where nutrients are absorbed. So in the small intestine, the acid from the stomach is neutralized. and I'm going to give you a chemical reaction, and I want you to see, not right now, but if you can figure it out, where HCl is stomach acid, it's hydrochloric acid, and your body releases something called sodium hydrogen carbonate. To neutralize it, and you could figure out the products for that. But that's not the main thing that happens. That is just kind of a precursor. The small intestine is surrounded by vast numbers of capillaries. And nutrients from the food are moved into the bloodstream. And don't worry, I'll put that back up. But this is a key thing. The mouth is where food comes in and digestion begins. Moves down the esophagus into the stomach. The stomach is all about digestion. This is where the bulk of the digestion happens. After the stomach, food goes to the small intestine, and that's where digestion occurs. That's where the body actually will absorb all the nutrients that's digested and put them into the bloodstream. And it's able to do that because wrapped all around the small intestine are capillaries, are lots of blood vessels. So there's arteries running to them. They branch to arterioles. Remember, it's arteries that go away from the heart to the body. And there, blood goes all around, and it's able to absorb all those nutrients. And then they empty out into venules and then veins that go back to the heart. And now, all of those nutrients can be sent anywhere in the body that they're needed. So this is where our circulatory system and our digestive system meet up with one another really directly. The large intestine is where excess water is reabsorbed and this does two things. One, it prevents water loss and dehydration. Right, your body needs a steady supply of water, and we don't want to lose it quickly. If we do lose it quickly, that can make us very sick. We call that dehydration. It also firms up the waste material for excretion. And then the rectum and the anus is where solid waste is excreted from the body. So you can pause that for a moment if you need. So I'll zoom in there because it occurs to me that I'm on a slightly weird Zoom schedule there. So that's a real flyby version of the digestive system. Now, this is by no means kind of a definitive, every little detail version of your digestive system. There's lots more detail. I encourage you to take grade 11 biology. We'll talk about a lot more. You can even just read about it. This is just sort of an introduction to this, which I hope you found interesting. In the time that remains today, you can work on your mitosis project. You can get your homework done from the cancer lesson if need be. You could definitely review again the circulatory system diagrams, draw those out a few times. And sorry, I know it's been a boring couple days of notes with me gone, but we'll do some fun stuff tomorrow when I'm back. Okay, ciao, bye.